House Leader of the Third Party.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to the Minister, what is the province of BC's relationship with Teck Resources?
Minister.
Thank you. Welcome to the member for Saanich and the North Islands. Before I address this question, I just want to go back to the last statement made by the member from Kootenay East. And clearly we don't necessarily see the same way, the picture of the natural gas industry and what's taking place in the Northeast. And I do again want to just repeat one of the things I spoke about yesterday around the certainty and predictability that is being provided to the gas industry and how companies are now sitting down with Treaty 8 nations and the BC Energy Regulator looking at 5 to 10-year plans, looking at how to minimize their footprints and create less disturbance, that these are not signs of exiting, that these are signs of confidence. And certainly that matches what I hear when I speak to gas companies. But again, as I said, I can see the member and I may not see eye to eye on that. With respect to the question on Teck from the member from Saanich and North Islands, as he knows, Teck is a major mining company here in British Columbia. It's a significant employer as well. The Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation is a regulator of Teck's activities, of their 5 operating mines and their numerous closed mines and exploration projects.
Member.
Thank you. It turns out that Teck's has other significance in that it's also a significant polluter. And over the last decades, the Kootenay Nation here in British Columbia, as well as indigenous nations in Pacific Northwest of the United States, have been complaining about the selenium pollution that has been caused by Teck. The fact that our regulatory process has actually failed to address the contamination that exists in the Elk Valley, and it's been spreading south and polluting in the United States as well. Kootenay and other nations have been asking and calling on the Canadian and U.S. governments to refer this persistent problem of the mines operated by Teck to the International Joint Commission. What's the minister's position on whether or not this issue should be referred to that commission?
Minister.
Thank you. First of all, I want to acknowledge right away that the selenium contamination issues that exist are serious, and none more so than to the Ktunaxa people. And their relationship to the land and the water is of utmost significance to them, and I would venture to all British Columbians. I want to assure the member as well that British Columbia, myself, my ministry, are committed to ensuring that we are a world-leading jurisdiction in mining regulation and oversight, health and safety, and that we collaborate with our colleagues at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, who of course have the responsibilities and authorities in many of these types of issues. I also want to explain that BC is continuing to make progress in responding to the concerns that have been raised, that we have developed new tools with respect to increasing accessibility and the transparency of information and the data that's related to water quality and regulatory activities in the Elk Valley, including the Elk Valley Water Quality Hub, an online portal for people to watch and see the results of the investments that Teck has made. And I think the member probably heard from the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy about the efforts that Teck has made, the $1.2 billion they've invested so far, and the $700 million, give or take, that they plan to continue investing in addressing this very serious issue. We know after President Biden met with Prime Minister Trudeau that a statement was released that our two countries intend to reach an agreement in principle to reduce and mitigate the impacts of water pollution in the Elk Kootenay watershed in partnership with Indigenous peoples on both sides of the border, with communities, with industry, to do what needs to be done to protect species and watershed health. I take this very seriously, of course, as do my colleagues in the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, and we will do everything that we can from the province of British Columbia to collaborate with our partners across the border, with Indigenous peoples, with communities, and with industry to do just that, work to reach that agreement and then undertake the activities after that agreement is reached. Thank you.
Member.
So with all of that, then, should be no issue with referring this to the Commission, then?
Minister.
Thank you. Yeah, to be more clear, I think BC's position has remained that an IJC reference isn't needed in the sense that it would be duplicative to processes are planned and that are already underway to address this, and that adding additional complexity with the transparency process, it may not clearly define what the problem is that needs to be solved. And with the announcement coming from the Prime Minister and the President's visit and the seeking of a collaborative agreement in principle on how these issues should be addressed, that's the path that we intend to follow.
Member.
The commission was created in the early 20th century in order to address exactly this, a collaborative approach, recognizing that these water courses start in one country, visit another country, and then end back in Canada, specifically this watershed, the Kootenay watershed. It has impacts on Indigenous people. It has impacts on all the residents that live in the area. The minister mentioned collaboration with the First Nations. There's quotes suggesting that the federal and provincial government have gone alone and have not included at least the Tanaha in their conversations about what the strategy is to go forward. We have a body that is created to deal with that collaborative need to ensure that people on both sides of the border are able to be confident in the processes. There has been a lot that's been written about this. I mean, the progress that's been made, as the minister has referred to it, despite the money that's been invested by Teck, selenium levels are still high. They're still not achieving what is needed to be achieved. $60 million in fines in 2021 for the company. $16 million in fines just this last month are an indication that this company is still challenged to be reducing these hazardous and toxic chemicals in the water course. The minister's predecessor and the Minister of Environment wrote in 2021 to the Foreign Affairs Minister, Melanie Joly, stating that the province maintains that there are other more efficient ways to address concerns around selenium levels, yet selenium levels remain high. Calvin Sanborn at the University of Victoria is quoted in an article saying the government of BC is aligning itself with Teck Corp and acceding to the request of Teck to oppose the International Joint Commission reference. And so it very much appears, if you just take a look at the lobbying record, this government, this minister, has been heavily lobbied by Teck. It seems like what we have here is we have a provincial government that has been walking in lockstep with the corporation that the minister suggests it's their responsibility, it's our responsibility to regulate. One of the comments that was made by Aaron Sexton of the University of Montana highlighted how basically the province and Teck are gatekeeping the data that are needed in order to be able to gain the confidence that what the minister is saying is happening is actually happening, suggesting straight up that one of the problems is that BC's professional reliance system has Teck responsible for collecting its own data and basically monitoring itself. The picture that's being painted here is not one of a relationship between a regulator and the company that's being regulated. It very much is the picture that's being painted is one of government and the company walking in lockstep with one another. Be interested to hear the minister's response to that, because that's definitely what's left in the public's imagination.
Minister.
Thank you. So I want to start off by again acknowledging that until recently, that decades of mining activity in the Elk Valley have led to significant waste rock accumulation, to alteration of lands and of the watercourses, poorly understood environmental impacts, degrading water quality trends, and that those trends are beginning, the trajectory is now beginning to change with the water treatment facilities that Teck has brought online and is required to do so. And the member referred to the lack of transparency around data, and I just want to say again that that's in part why the Elk Valley Water Quality Hub has been brought online as a portal for people to see directly the data and see the trends of where selenium levels are going. The member also referred to Tunaka and the province not collaborating, but I want to go back to 2014 and the development of the Elk Valley Water Quality Plan, which was approved as part of the area-based management plan, work that was done collaboratively between the province, between the federal government, and the Tunaka Nation. And I know the member and I have discussed these kinds of things before about just how important it is for Indigenous peoples, for the First Nations to be directly involved in the management of those plans, and as time goes by, for more integration of Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge to be a part of those plans and the way that environmental qualities are monitored and measured over time. The member refers to some of the administrative monetary penalties that have been applied, and I know he understands that these issues are under the purview of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, but just to read into the record too, that over 200 inspections have been completed since 2014, since the Elk Valley Water Quality Plan was developed, and that the increasing numbers of administrative penalty referrals for ongoing non-compliances have resulted in over $17.2 million assessed against Teck, because these are serious issues and they should be taken seriously, and I believe that they are, certainly by us and I believe by Teck as well. And some of those non-compliances occurred between 2019 and 2021 because of delays in implementing the water treatment that's very much required. The Ministry of Environment, the Minister is in the process of kicking off a process to update the area-based management plan. And the work that we've been just talking about, the President and the Prime Minister released their statement about a collaborative process. This process is really key. And I note that the federal government has not requested an IJC reference, and in some senses the province is at mercy of the federal government doing so. This is an international joint commission. And it is so important to me, again, that the Tunaka have a primary role in the development of that collaborative agreement and in the activities that occur afterwards. There is so much trust that needs to be built or rebuilt. And I don't think that we're alone in the southeast of British Columbia when it comes to the result of industrial activities on the land base and in First Nations territories. And indeed, what we went through with the Blueberry River First Nation and seeing the result of decades of industrial activities in the Northeast and the impact on Treaty 8 rights, those principles must be expanded across British Columbia. And that's why, in part, our government created the new ministry, the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship. Now, of course, that's being led by a new minister to do just that, which is to reframe and develop a new approach to co-management and shared decision-making on the land base, one that affirms, protects, responds to First Nations rights and title, and puts them at the center of decision-making. We have a lot of work to do in the southeast of British Columbia. I will never shy away from that and remain committed to that which needs to be done, because in the end, I think we are all seeking to find ways of undertaking activities that provide good jobs for people, including Indigenous peoples, as we're seeing with more equity stakes and more involvement in industrial projects, but one that respects the environment and doesn't diminish it for the needs for future generations, the services that ecosystems provide for people and for other species, and ultimately that respects reconciliation And I know that the member and I share these goals, and I really appreciate his feedback and comments. Thank you.
Member.
Last question. Thank you to the member for Kootenay East for this opportunity. I think when I had a whole other bunch of questions to be asking energy, mines, and low carbon innovation. It's a large ministry. I think when I take a look at the mining industry and the reality that the provincial government continues to fight with First Nations about mineral claims, that we're going to court. We're in court now on it. So, you know, it's pretty difficult for me to fully embrace the fact that this ministry has figured out how to engage First Nations. We have one of the oldest acts in the province that has been long promised to be reformed and updated. I talked about it with the minister's predecessor last year. And yet, a year later, 12 months later, Indigenous nations are in court about how their territories and claims are being staked on their territories. Seemingly glacial progress being made on this. There's, since the 2014 date that the minister gave, there's a quote in an article that I just finished reading from the chief of the Tanaha, complaining that the federal and provincial government were making decisions about Teck without the inclusion of the Tanaha. So it makes it difficult for me to really fully embrace that this ministry has figured out how to engage Indigenous nations in a way that is inclusive of them when we're fighting in court, and when we've got chiefs being quoted just a few months ago about being excluded from this. Where Indigenous nations on the other side of the border are complaining that the pollution coming from the Elk Valley is damaging their fisheries. It makes it difficult when we take a look at the lobbying record and see that this company has 28 registered lobbyists. 4 of them are former members of the current government, the connections directly with this current government. 8 official lobbyist meetings this year, with another 17 in the last quarter of 2022. The meetings include meetings with the minister, with the DMs and ADMs, with the chief of staff, with the minister of the environment, with the premier, 3 of them this year, with the former premier, the head of the public service, and the premier's chief of staff. It is very clear that this company has very, very close connections. And then, last week, the former premier, who was the chief decision maker in this government, joins the board. How is it that we are to have any confidence that when a company that is making regular calls every day to report environmental infractions that are existing in this province, they're making those calls every single day. How are we to have any confidence when 20 minutes after resigning the seat, the former premier is now on the board of directors of a spin-off company that's going to be formed? Please, to the minister, I ask the minister to please give the people of British Columbia the confidence that the relationship between the government as the regulator and the company as the regulated is not so cozy that the poison will just continue and that it will just be covered over with political rhetoric and nice words, but yet we continue to see the pollution, we can continue to see the environmental infractions, and the fines, the administrative fines, they sound like big numbers, but when you take a look at the fact that Teck profited more than $1 billion in the final quarter, you realize just the scale and scope of the penalties that we're actually administering to this company. So the people of British Columbia need to know that the relationship, specifically now that the former premier, the person who was making decisions right up until 4 months ago, who's now on the board, the active lobbying that's going on by this company, that the relationship between the regulated and the regulator is one that can be trusted in this province.
Minister.
Thank you. So I'll go a few different places here and try to address a number of the comments that the member made. And at the outset, I just want to say again, I really thank him for his feedback, and I don't disagree with some of the things that he says. And at the outset, what this really boils down to is that we need to do better. And I accept that, and I accept the feedback and the criticism that he provides. I do want to speak a little bit about the division of roles and responsibilities within our system of government, and the separation between political decisions that are made by us as elected leaders and the decisions that are made by the public service, primarily in their roles as set out in legislation as statutory decision makers. And the differentiation between the roles that people in energy, mines, and low carbon innovation play with respect to administering the Mines Act and making decisions around permitting and authorizations in mining, and the responsibility of through the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy under their authorities as defined in the Environmental Management Act. And that clear division of responsibilities is an important part of our system, so that we have an activity being regulated and overseen through one ministry, and the impacts of that activity being overseen and regulated through another ministry. I also want to point out that since 2014, when the area-based management plan was approved, we have substantially increased the bonds that are required for the company, and will continue to take steps as needed to help improve their performance and protect the interests of the environment and of British Columbians. The member spoke to the Mineral Tenure Act and the need to modernize it. The current court case that's going on, of course, the member will understand that I won't comment specifically on the court case, except to say that we respect nations' rights to pursue their interests through the legal system. And I think that all of us want to get to a place where these kinds of issues can be resolved outside the courts. That's always our primary goal. And that our deep commitment to advancing reconciliation is guided by the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and the Declaration Act Action Plan, which clearly lays out the priority to modernize the Mineral Tenure Act. This is an ancient, archaic piece of legislation that was designed to divide, to separate Indigenous peoples from their lands and from the resources. And we know that this act needs to be changed. I'm very deeply committed to that work. It's in my mandate letter, but more importantly, it's in the Declaration Act Action Plan. It has been consistently identified as a priority by First Nations, and we have undertaken the initial work with First Nations Leadership Council. We need to do this work with First Nations rights and title holders, because the FNLC, of course, is not the rights and title holders. And we need to do this work well, so that we make lasting change, and we need to do this work in parallel with working with industry and with communities to make this the durable change that's required. Outside of the Mineral Tenure Act modernization, we are doing work to address certain concerns, and the work that we can do now is that work to co-develop those changes to the Mineral Tenure Act are occurring, and that will include things like better integration of mining interests into land use planning. And I spoke in a previous answer around the importance of a land use planning process that is done together with First Nations, that puts them at the center of that planning process, so that it provides more predictability and certainty for industry, that it protects the ecological, cultural, spiritual interests and values of First Nations and Indigenous peoples, and still allows for some activity in the right places at the right times for sustainable jobs and to support communities and prosperous communities. This also includes developing a process to better enable or notify, a notification process to notify First Nations of events like claims. And that work is going to continue to go on. And then finally, the member spoke around lobbying, and I do want to make a few comments on that. And there is a lobbying registry, of course, that exists because British Columbians need the transparency to see who am I meeting with, who are public officials meeting with. But again, I spoke about the roles and responsibilities of the public service versus elected officials. And again, I think to best understand companies' interests and discuss with them their goals and how they need to be met, and how our legislative standards and requirements need to be met, those meetings need to take place. I also meet with First Nations, with local governments, with environmental groups, and many of those don't appear on the lobbyist registry because it's not required. But it's very important for me as an elected official to take that balanced approach and to hear a number of perspectives and consider all of those interests. That's my job as an elected official, and that's my job as a minister of the Crown. And I take that responsibility very seriously. I know the member understands this. We've talked about it before. The final words I want to add is just with respect to the former Premier being appointed to the board of Teck Resources. And one of the things that I admire the most about the former Premier is his complete dedication and leadership in passing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And it's that kind of commitment and that kind of vision that I think will serve us well in seeing somebody like him serve on a board. That was his choice. And I'm sure that he will do his very best and use all of the skills that he has to help bring together Tūnaka, the company, the communities, and serve the interests of all. Thank you.